We welcome you to the Bible study today. Turning your Bibles to Job chapter 16. Job chapter 16 will be the lesson for today. In verses 1 through 5, we see Job's description of his friends as miserable comforters. Job 16 to Job 17 features round 2 of these speeches between Job and his friends. Verses 1 through 5. Verse 1, then Job answered and said, again, this is the beginning of Job's response. Job 16 to Job 17, to the second round. This is Job's 5th speech in the book. Verse 2. I have heard many things, many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Job's response to Eliphaz and the other friends. Not only had Job heard what was said by Eliphaz, Job had already heard all these things before. He calls them all miserable comforters. Literally, they are comforters of trouble. They brought trouble. He contrasts the troubles that they offered with their so-called consolations. In Job 15:11, he talks of the consolations of God, as if God had given them these words of consolation or comfort, and that Job was being foolish for rejecting those words. But here Job responds, contrast to what Eliphaz has just said in the previous chapter, miserable comforters. There are sorry comforters. Verse 3, shall words of wind have an end, or what provokes you that you answer? Job turns the words of Eliphaz back on himself. Job 15 and verse 2, Job asked if his empty words will ever cease. Job asks what provokes him that he continues to answer. Verse 4, I also could speak as you do. If your soul were in my soul's place, I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you. Here in verse 4, Job tells Eliphaz that he could speak as Eliphaz speaks to him. He was very harsh in the last chapter. Eliphaz could be in his place. Job could bring together words against him or heap them up and treat him with the same kind of ridicule. In this context, to shake the head is to shake the head in scorn. We see a similar usage of the word in Psalm 22:7 and also Jeremiah 48:27. As you read this passage, this chapter, you see similarities to what we see in the crucifixion scene of Christ. The prophecy that we read in Psalm 22 and the fulfillment in the New Testament, in the gospel account. Verse 5, but I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips would relieve your grief. So yes, Job could act as Eliphaz is acting toward him if he were in his place. He could heap up words against Eliphaz and the friends. He could shake his head at him, at the friends. But he said, I would strengthen you with my mouth if our situations were reversed. Job assures Eliphaz that if their situations were reversed, he would strengthen him with the words of his mouth and relieve his grief with the comfort of his lips. Some people think that Job here is speaking sarcastically. That is, if their situations were reversed, Job could strengthen him with his mouth and relieve him of his grief with his lips like Eliphaz had done for him. Of course, he hadn't relieved his grief or strengthened him with his lips. And so I could strengthen you with my mouth, speaking sarcastically as Eliphaz had done for him. However, just reading the text as it stands here in the New King James, he said, while Eliphaz had done this, he could do the same, but instead, I will strengthen you. I will comfort you. Verses 6 to 14, we see God's treatment of Job, according to Job himself. Verse 6, though I speak, my grief is not relieved. And if I remain silent, how am I eased? Sometimes it helps to talk. Job says that even though he speaks out, his grief is not relieved. He is still experiencing great grief. He also says that if he remains silent, he would still have his grief. His grief would not be eased. Verse 7, but now he has worn me out. You have made desolate all my company. Job speaks to Eliphaz and his friends, saying, he has worn me out. Who is the he? What is the antecedent of the pronoun he in this passage? He has worn me out. Job now turns his attention back to God. First, Job addresses God in the third person, he. He has done this. Job says that God has worn him out. The same word is used in Job 4:2 and Job 4:5, where Eliphaz actually uses the word in reference to Job being weary. Second, he addresses God in the second person, you. And Job speaks directly to God, saying how God has made desolate all his company. His children were taken, and then his health was taken. Following his affliction was the estrangement of his brothers and his acquaintances, along with his relatives, his close friends, and his servants. He says more of this in Job 19:13-20. And so he has worn me out, Job said of God. He has worn me out. He has exhausted me. Verse 8, you have shriveled me up, and it is a witness against me. My leanness rises up against me and bears witness to my face. Job tells God how he has shriveled him up, that God is shriveled up, or that Job is shriveled up, serves as a witness against Job. He further says that his leanness rises up as a witness, as if in a court of law, against him, and bears witness to his face against him. The same term later is rendered cut down in Job 22:16. You have shriveled me up, you cut me down. Verse 9, he tears me in his wrath and hates me. He gnashes at me with his teeth. My adversary sharpens his gaze on me. Against him, Job answers God in the third person, he. And so Job describes God's attack. First, God tears him in his wrath and hates him. This is Job's perception of events, unaided by revelation. He was ignorant of what was really going on, and as were the friends. But this is the way that he feels. He feels as though God is attacking him. And so he describes him in these graphic ways. Verse 9 first, that God tears him and that God hates him. It's as though God is bearing or holding a grudge against him. Job later says that God has become cruel to him and God opposes him. Job 30:21, he said, "But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me." Second, Job says that God gnashes at him with his teeth. And it's as though God bites at Job as if a beast. Third, Job describes God as his adversary or enemy who sharpens his gaze on him. And so his eyes are fixed intently or sharply upon him. One might think of sharp teeth gnashing at him. And then second, we see his eyes sharpened upon him. We know from our study that the true adversary was Satan. Job 1:6 and chapter 2 and verse 2. The name Satan means adversary. Verse 10, they gape at me with their mouth. They strike me reproachfully on the cheek. They gather together against me. Job now describes the conduct of the ungodly and the wicked in chapter 16:11. First, they gape at him with their mouth. And so, as we see in Job 29:23, they open their mouth wide. So, like a gaping hole is a very large hole. In this case, they gape at him with their mouth. And so they open their mouth wide against Job. David wrote in Psalm 22:13, they gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. And again in Psalm 35:21, David wrote, they also opened their mouth wide against me and said, aha, aha, our eyes have seen it. Verse 11, he continues, but here we see in the same passage, verse 10, that they strike me reproachfully on the cheek. And so they blamed him with contempt and scorn. And third, they gather together against him. And so it's as though they're uniting together against Job. Verse 11, God has delivered me to the ungodly and turned me over to the hands of the wicked. Job specifically names God as his adversary in this passage. He says that God has delivered him, or God has turned him over to the wicked. Verse 12, I was at ease, but he has shattered me. He also has taken me by my neck and shaken me to pieces. He has set me up for his target. Job says that he was at ease. Prior to his affliction, he lived in quietness, at ease and secure. However, such quietness was interrupted by the abruptness of his affliction. First, Job says that God shattered him, broke him apart. Second, Job also says that it is as though God had taken him by his neck and had shaken him to pieces. Third, God, as a man leading archers, had Job set up for his target. 13, his archers surround me. He pierces my heart and does not pity. He pours out my gall on the ground. Job says that the archers of God surround him. God, through his archers, with his archers, pierces Job's heart, and his gall spills out onto the ground. God does not pity him. Again, These are the feelings of Job. He was not correct, but these are his feelings. What about the heart? We often speak metaphorically of the heart today. We love somebody with all our hearts. The heart in this passage may literally be translated kidneys. We do not use the word kidneys in the same way as we do heart today. The term may be used in a literal fashion for the bodily organ of the kidneys, or it may be used metaphorically for the inmost being of man, similar to how we use heart today in a metaphoric sense. For example, heart may be used metaphorically for the mind or for the emotions of man. For example, Job says in Job 19:27, how my heart yearns within me. Again, literally kidneys, but the translation is better heart, and in a way that we would better understand the passage today. How my heart yearns within me. And so his seat of emotions, his mind. Again, the same term is used metaphorically for the inmost being of man. Proverbs 23:16, he said, yes, my inmost being will rejoice when your lips speak right things. And the same word is used there for inmost being. The term gall is from a word meaning bitterness. The word gall or bile may refer to what is bitter. Deuteronomy 32:32. Sometimes it's used in that fashion, speaking of bitterness. Literally, it may refer to the bitter fluid from the gallbladder. So here in this particular passage, he says that God pierces his heart and that God pours out his gall on the ground. And so again, it's a picture that Job has painted of God not pitying him, as if God, by his archers, pierced Job's heart and that his gall spilled out onto the ground. Very graphic picture. Verse 14, he breaks me with wound upon wound. He runs at me like a warrior. Job says that God breaks him. Earlier he said shattered. He shattered me. He breaks him with wound upon wound. It's as though an army, as if an army, how it breaks through a wall with breach upon breach until the wall is destroyed or is collapsed. You might picture people with battering rams and beating upon a walled city, and they pound upon the city. They ram the wall until there's a breach, and then another breach, and then another breach, until the wall falls and the army enters the city. Here, Job says he breaks me with wound upon wound. It might read like he breaks me with break upon break. Or as some versions read, he breaks me with breach upon breach. A breach is like a hole in a wall. He also runs at me like a warrior. And so here's the picture of God as a mighty man, as a warrior, fighting against him, and he is unable to resist. In verses 15 to 17, we see Job's reaction to his perception of God. Verse 15, I have sewn sackcloth over my skin and laid my head in the dust. The wearing of sackcloth was a sign of mourning. First, Job says that he had sewn sackcloth over his skin. we read in the Bible of people wearing sackcloth, but this is different. He had sewn sackcloth over his skin. What does it mean? Well, perhaps it means that Job expected to be mourning or in sorrow for the rest of his life. And so it's not just him wearing it, he has sewn sackcloth over his skin. Second, he laid his head in the dust. The sprinkling of dust on the head was also an expression of mourning, like we see in Job 2 and verse 12. The picture of sprinkling dust, or perhaps throwing dust into the air and it falling on his head, throwing dust towards the heaven, towards the sky, and it falling on his head. This term for head in this passage, I laid my head in the dust, is most frequently translated as horn. And in the Bible, horn was a symbol of strength. And so the covering or the laying of his horn in the dust may be symbolic of his humiliation and his weakness. So either way, here you have Job laying his head. His head is laid in the dust, a sign of sorrow, or the idea of his horn, his strength is laid in the dust. It's covered over in his humiliation. Verse 16. My face is flushed from weeping, and on my eyelids is a shadow of death. Job says that his face is flushed with weeping. The term flushed is literally red. My face is red from weeping. But the idea of flushed is correct. My face is flushed. That is, my face is tinted or tinged with red, or redness from crying, from weeping. Flushed with weeping, or red with weeping. Also, his weeping has caused this darkness. He describes it as the shadow of death on his eyes. His eyes paint a picture of his health. It's as though he's a dying man, the shadow of death. And so it appears that he has these dark circles under his eyes. Sometimes people today get dark circles under their eyes for different reasons. One such reason is that of weeping and crying. Perhaps the face is red or flushed, and the eyelids, this dark shadow, or the eyes, the dark circles under the eyes. Job was not getting any sleep. We saw that earlier in our study. Verse 17. Although no violence is in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Job's weeping was not because he mourned over his wickedness. With sackcloth, sometimes people, the custom was, would wear sackcloth, maybe mourning over some tragedy, or perhaps mourning over their own sin or the sin of a people. And so perhaps seeking God and fasting and prayer and wearing sackcloth as a sign of their mourning. In this case, Job's weeping was not because he mourned over his wickedness. He did not believe he was a wicked man. He believed he was innocent of any charges that might have merited his suffering. Job suffered in spite of his innocence. First, he says that he wept, although he committed no violence. Second, he says that he wept, although his prayer is pure. Again, the idea of innocence. This is contrary to what Eliphaz had said to Job in the previous speech. You restrain prayer before God. Remember how he said you cast off God, fear of God, and restrain prayer or meditation before God? Job 15 and 4. The idea of restrain or hinder. Sin can hinder prayer or a meditation before God. And Job says, my prayer before God is pure. He was not a wicked man. In verses 18 to 22, we see Job's witness in heaven. Verse 18, O earth, do not cover my blood, and let my cry have no resting place. Job wants vindication, even if his vindication came after his death. Job believed that his death was near. First, Job asked the earth not to cover his blood. Second, Job asks for his cry to find no resting place. He wants his cry, the cry of his blood, to be heard. And so perhaps if he died, he wanted vindication after his death, vindication of his innocence. This was important to him, to say the least. What about I read this passage and perhaps you think of the same thing, the killing of Cain. That is, that Cain killed his brother. The Lord confronted Cain after Cain killed his brother Abel. You remember the account in Genesis. The righteous blood of Abel cried out for vindication from the ground to the Lord. Genesis 4, 9 to 10. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Cain was not only a murderer, Cain was a liar. He knew exactly where his brother was. He had killed him and had covered him up. But according to God, his brother's blood cried out to God, the Lord, from the ground. So I think of that passage when I read here in Job 15 and 18. Job wants vindication, even if he has already died. Verse 19, surely even now my witness is in heaven, and my evidence is on high. Job is confident that he has a witness in heaven. He believes he is innocent. His evidence is on high in heaven. Here, Job acknowledges the existence of heaven. What about after we die? You read the passage. He acknowledges heaven. My witness is in heaven. Verse 20. My friends scorn me. My eyes pour out tears to God. While the friends of Job scorn him, mock or ridicule him, he has a witness in heaven. Verse 19. Job weeps to God, who he is confident sees Job from heaven, from on high. Verse 21. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleads for his neighbor. Job desires that someone might plead for him with God. Remember earlier in Job 9, 32 to 35, how Job desired a mediator between God and himself who would lay his hand on both God and himself. Job looked at himself as a mortal man, and here is Almighty God. And so he desired a mediator. Here, Job desires that someone might plead for him with God. How so? As a man pleads for his neighbor or friend. Verse 22, last verse of the chapter. For when a few years are finished, I shall go the way of no return. Job believed that if he died, he would not return to this life. Verse 22, Job speaks of a few years. This does not mean that Job thought that he still had years remaining. This simply means that his years were numbered. For when a few years are finished, it would not be long before his days were finished. At least that's what Job thought, given his affliction, given his condition. He didn't envision very long remaining for himself. He believed that his years were numbered, not numberless. And from what we read in the book of Job so far in our study, and from what follows, Job believed that his death was imminent. If you read the very next verse of the following chapter, Job 17:1, Job says, "My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished, the grave is ready for me." Those are not the words of a man who thinks that he still has years remaining. He believed that his time, the grave, was near. That concludes our study for the book of Job, chapter 15. And Lord willing, we'll continue with the book next time. I encourage you to continue to study. There's always more to learn, but I hope that this has been helpful in your understanding of the book of Job. Thank you for being here today.